The snow fell in thick, swirling flakes, covering the forest floor in an endless blanket of white. The air was crisp and biting, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, but Isolde Whitaker had long grown used to the unforgiving winters of Montana. Her forest ranger uniform, a deep green that stood out starkly against the snow, was lined for warmth, but even so, she felt the sting of the wind against her exposed skin. Her boots crunched with each careful step along the isolated trail, her eyes scanning the quiet expanse for anything unusual. Tracks in the snow, signs of a struggling animal, or something that simply didn't belong. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind through the barren branches. But then, she saw something up ahead, and it stopped her in her tracks. Standing motionless in the middle of the snow-covered road was a young foal, its slender legs trembling under the weight of its small, fragile body. Its coat was a rich, warm chestnut, dusted with a delicate layer of snow, and its dark eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Isolde's heart clenched at the sight. The foal was alone. No herd, no mother, just an abandoned creature, vulnerable against the relentless cold. The biting wind blew between them, ruffling its already damp mane, but the foal didn't flinch. It simply stood there, watching her, waiting. Slowly, Isolde crouched down, lowering herself onto one knee, making herself smaller so as not to scare the fragile creature. She extended a gloved hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Hey there, little one. What are you doing out here all alone?" The foal flicked an ear but didn't back away. That was odd. Most wild horses, especially young ones, would bolt at the sight of a human. Yet this one remained rooted to the spot, its muscles tense but unmoving, as if torn between fear and familiarity. As she inched closer, her trained eyes swept over its body, searching for injuries. There were no visible wounds, no limping, no immediate signs of distress, aside from the fact that it was clearly freezing. Its legs trembled with fatigue, and she could see its breath coming out in short, shallow puffs. This foal had been out here for a while. But why? And where was its mother? Her stomach tightened at the thought of what that might mean. A young horse alone in the wild was never a good sign. Glancing around, Isolde searched the snow-covered landscape for any movement. Perhaps a herd hidden among the trees, a sign of tracks leading away, something to explain why this foal was standing here, waiting for her. But all she saw was endless white and the soft, shifting shadows of the forest. The realization gnawed at her. This wasn't right. Something was off. And the way the foal refused to move, refused to run, only deepened the unease settling in her chest. Then she noticed something so small, so subtle, that she almost missed it. The foal wasn't lost. It wasn't abandoned. It was waiting for her. And when she realized the reason why, her heart ached in a way she hadn't expected. The foal didn't move, not even when Isolde took another cautious step forward. It simply stood there, its dark eyes locked onto hers, as if trying to communicate something beyond words. The snow continued to fall in thick, silent flakes, settling onto the foal's damp coat. Isolde could see the way its ribs faintly pressed against its thin hide, the way its breath trembled in the freezing air. This little one was exhausted, barely holding itself up. Instinct told her that time was running out. Her training as a ranger had taught her many things: how to track animals, how to recognize distress signals, how to deal with injuries in the wild, but nothing had prepared her for this unsettling feeling twisting inside her. This wasn't just a lost foal. It was something more. Something she didn't yet understand. Slowly, she reached out again, this time letting her gloved fingers barely graze the foal's muzzle. The warmth of its breath against her skin was faint, too faint. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. "You're safe now." But the foal didn't react like a scared, wild creature. It didn't flinch, didn't rear back, didn't try to run. Instead, it did something that made Isolde's chest tighten. It leaned into her touch. The fragile weight of its head pressed gently against her hand, as if seeking comfort, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for her. Isolde swallowed hard, feeling an unexpected lump in her throat. It was as if this tiny, vulnerable creature had been searching for her specifically. But why? Then, as if remembering something urgent, the foal suddenly lifted its head and turned, taking a few unsteady steps toward the trees. It paused, looking back at her, ears flicking forward. Isolde frowned. "You want me to follow you?" she murmured, barely aware that she was speaking aloud. The foal took another step, then stopped again, looking back once more. There was no hesitation in its body language. It was guiding her, leading her somewhere. A shiver ran down her spine, but it had nothing to do with the cold. Isolde's instincts screamed that she had to follow. Whatever this foal was trying to show her, it was important. Taking a steadying breath, she adjusted the radio on her shoulder, making sure she could call for backup if needed, and stepped forward. The foal's ears twitched in response, as if relieved, and it began walking again, deeper into the snowy forest. And with each step she took after it, Isolde couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something she wasn't prepared for. Something that would change everything. Isolde followed the foal cautiously, her boots sinking into the fresh snow with each step. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. The foal walked ahead of her, its delicate hooves leaving faint imprints in the pristine white. It moved with purpose, though its body swayed with exhaustion, as if every step required more strength than it had left. Her pulse quickened. Whatever this foal was leading her to, it had to be close. She adjusted the radio on her shoulder, considering whether to call for backup. But what would she even say? That a wild foal was guiding her through the forest, as if it had a message only she could understand? It sounded ridiculous. So instead, she pressed forward, focusing on the way the foal would glance back at her every few steps, as if making sure she was still following. And then she saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They were partially buried beneath the freshly fallen snow, but still visible, deep, uneven, and heading in the same direction the foal was leading her. A jolt of adrenaline shot through Isolde as she crouched down, brushing away some of the snow to get a clearer look. The tracks weren't old. Someone had passed through here recently. Her stomach twisted. The foal had been alone when she found it. No mother. No herd. And now, human footprints? The connection sent a chill down her spine, and for the first time, she realized just how wrong this situation felt. She stood up quickly, scanning the forest. The trees stretched endlessly around her, their bare branches weighed down by frost, concealing whatever lay ahead. But now, it wasn't just about the foal. Someone had been here. Recently. And judging by the way the foal kept pressing forward, that someone might still be nearby. Isolde placed a hand on the radio clipped to her jacket, hesitating. The protocol was clear. If there was any sign of a person in distress, she needed to report it immediately. But something inside her whispered to wait, to see where this foal was taking her first. So she did. The foal let out a soft, almost pleading sound, its delicate frame shaking slightly from the cold. Then, with one last glance at her, it pressed forward, its pace quickening despite its clear exhaustion. Isolde clenched her jaw and followed, her heart pounding harder now. She didn't know what she was about to find. But she knew, deep in her bones, that this was no coincidence. The foal moved faster now, its thin legs cutting through the deep snow with newfound urgency. Isolde quickened her pace to keep up, her heart pounding as the wind howled through the trees. The footprints alongside them remained visible, stretching deeper into the forest. Whoever had left them was headed in the same direction. And that realization made her pulse hammer in her ears. The further they walked, the more Isolde's instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The foal wasn't just guiding her somewhere, it was desperate for her to follow. Then, up ahead, a shape broke the perfect white of the snow. At first, it was just a dark mass, half buried beneath the drifting powder. But as she stepped closer, the details sharpened. A heavy coat. A motionless form. A person. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hey!" Isolde called, her voice cutting through the cold air. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the figure. A man lay there, his body partially covered by the snowfall. His face was pale, lips tinged with blue. He wasn't moving. Panic surged through her as she reached out, pressing her fingers against the side of his neck. For one agonizing second, she felt nothing. Then, a pulse. Weak. Faint. But there. He was alive. She grabbed her radio, pressing the button with numb fingers. "Ranger Whitaker here. I have an unconscious male, approximately mid-40s, hypothermic, unresponsive but breathing. Requesting immediate medical assistance. Coordinates incoming." Static crackled, then a voice responded. "Copy that, Whitaker. Stay put, help is on the way." Isolde exhaled, but the relief was brief. The foal had stepped closer now, nudging the man's arm with its muzzle, as if urging him to wake up. The realization hit her all at once. This wasn't a wild horse. This foal knew this man. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of what had happened. There was no blood, no obvious injuries, but his body was limp, as if he had collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. His boots were caked with ice, his gloves dusted with frost. How long had he been out here? Isolde shrugged off her coat and draped it over him, trying to preserve what little body heat he had left. "Hey, can you hear me?" she urged, shaking his shoulder gently. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a barely audible groan, the man's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted, and a single word slipped out. "Zephyr." Isolde froze. She looked at the foal, who was still nudging the man's arm, its dark eyes filled with something that looked almost like sorrow. Zephyr. The foal's name. This man had come out here for him. And something told her he hadn't expected to make it back. The word barely left the man's lips before his head lolled to the side, his body sinking further into the snow. Zephyr. The foal let out a soft, desperate whinny, pressing its muzzle against the man's shoulder as if trying to shake him awake. The sight sent a sharp pang through Isolde's chest. Who was he? And why had he come out here with this foal, alone, unprepared, and on the verge of freezing to death? Isolde pressed the radio to her lips, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's conscious, barely. Hurry." "ETA 5 minutes, the dispatcher confirmed, but 5 minutes felt like an eternity. She turned back to the man, brushing more snow from his face. His dark stubble was flecked with frost, his features sunken from cold and exhaustion. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way his face softened slightly when he murmured the foal's name, or the way Zephyr refused to leave his side. "Can you hear me?" she asked again, louder this time. His eyelids fluttered, and for a brief second his gaze met hers, dazed, unfocused. But then his lips moved again, and this time the words were clearer. "Had to get him away." Isolde stiffened. Away from what? The man shuddered, barely able to keep his eyes open. They took them all. Zephyr, he's the last one." Her pulse kicked up a notch. Who took them? But the man didn't answer. His head slumped forward again, breath shallow, body limp. Isolde grabbed his wrist. His pulse was still there, but weaker. She swore under her breath. He was slipping back under. And she still had no idea what he was talking about. She glanced at Zephyr, who stood motionless beside the man, his large eyes filled with something that looked far too much like grief. A sick feeling crept up Isolde's spine. This wasn't just a case of an abandoned foal and a lost man. Something bigger was happening here. And if what he said was true, if they had taken all the others, then someone had wanted this foal gone. Which meant that whoever they were, they wouldn't be happy that he had survived. And now, neither would she. The man didn't wake again. His breathing remained shallow, his body unnaturally still beneath the heavy coat Isolde had draped over him. She kept one hand on his wrist, monitoring his pulse as the minutes dragged on. Zephyr stood beside them, his small frame shaking, though whether from cold or distress, she couldn't tell. The words the man had managed to say echoed in her mind, looping over and over. They took them all. Zephyr, he's the last one. She had seen enough illegal hunting operations in her years as a ranger to know when something didn't add up. Wild horse herds in this area weren't uncommon, but they were protected. The idea that an entire herd could just disappear without a trace sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Who would take them? And why? The sound of an approaching engine cut through the silence, snapping her from her thoughts. The rescue team. 2 snowmobiles emerged from the tree line, kicking up flurries of white powder as they came to a stop. 2 paramedics jumped off first, followed by her fellow ranger, Leif Danner, his expression tight with concern. What happened? Leif asked, kneeling beside her as the paramedics got to work checking the man's vitals. Isolde exhaled, rubbing her cold fingers together. Found him collapsed out here. Hypothermia. Exhaustion. But before he passed out, he said something strange. Leif frowned. Strange how? She hesitated, watching as the paramedics carefully lifted the unconscious man onto a stretcher. She knew how this sounded. She still wasn't sure she believed it herself. He said, they took all of them. That this foal, Zephyr, is the last one. Leif's expression darkened instantly. His gaze flicked to Zephyr, then back to the man, then to her. You think he's talking about a herd? Yeah. And if he is, that means someone wiped out an entire group of wild horses. She swallowed hard. That's not something poachers could pull off quietly. Someone would have noticed. Leif's jaw tightened. Not if they had help. That made her stomach twist. The idea of an organized operation, people with power, resources, and a reason to keep things quiet, was far more terrifying than a few rogue hunters. The paramedics secured the man onto the snowmobile, ready to transport him back to the station. As they did, Zephyr let out a distressed sound, stepping forward. He didn't want to leave the man. Isolde's throat tightened. This wasn't just any human to Zephyr. She made a decision. I'll take the foal back with me, she said firmly. If he really is the last one, we need to protect him. Leif gave her a long, measuring look, then nodded. Yeah. And we need to find out who the hell wanted him gone. As the rescue team disappeared into the trees, taking the unconscious man with them, Isolde placed a reassuring hand on Zephyr's trembling body. Something terrible had happened out here, and she was going to find out exactly what. The storm had settled into a steady snowfall by the time Isolde guided Zephyr back toward her truck. The foal hesitated at first, his ears flicking nervously at the sight of the unfamiliar vehicle, but when she placed a gentle hand on his neck, he let out a slow exhale and stepped forward. He was exhausted. She could feel the slight tremor in his muscles, the way he leaned into her for warmth. Leif helped secure Zephyr in the trailer they used for wildlife rescues, his hands moving quickly despite the numbing cold. You sure about this? He asked, his breath fogging in the air. If someone really did wipe out a whole herd, they might come looking for him. I know, Isolde murmured, glancing at the foal. But if that man was right, if Zephyr is the last one, then he's not safe out here. We need to figure out what happened. Leif sighed and nodded. I'll start asking around. See if anyone's reported unusual activity in the area. As they drove back to the ranger station, Isolde kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Zephyr stood quietly in the trailer, his small frame swaying slightly with each turn. Despite everything, he was calm. Almost too calm. She had worked with wild horses before, and none had ever acted quite like this. Foals separated from their herds were usually frantic, panicked. But Zephyr? He had walked straight to her, led her to the man. As if he had known she was the only one who could help. Something about this wasn't natural. Back at the station, Isolde set Zephyr up in a small enclosure near the stables. The vet would be coming by soon to check him over, but for now, she made sure he was warm and had plenty of food. He lowered his head to the hay she spread for him, but he wasn't eating, just sniffing, distracted, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Isolde rubbed her arms, trying to shake the unease settling deep in her bones. She turned toward the office, needing answers. She pulled up the station's database, searching recent reports about wild horse sightings. Normally, herds were seen near the Blackridge Basin, a few miles from where she had found Zephyr. But the last recorded sighting had been nearly 3 weeks ago. A ranger named Ansel Merrick had noted a healthy herd of 12 roaming the area. 12 horses. Gone. Vanished without a trace. She pulled up a map, studying the terrain. The basin was isolated, but not impossible to reach. Whoever took them must have known the land well enough to move fast and leave no evidence. Her gut twisted. That meant this wasn't a random act. Someone had planned this. A soft whinny pulled her attention back to the window. Zephyr stood near the fence, his ears perked, his body tense. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the woods. Isolde felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Slowly, she turned her gaze to the tree line. And that's when she saw it. Half hidden in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the station's floodlights, was a figure. Watching them. Isolde's breath caught in her throat. The figure stood at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the station's floodlights. Tall. Motionless. Watching. The snow fell in heavy silence, muting the world around her, but she could feel the weight of that gaze pressing against her like a physical force. Zephyr let out another soft whinny, shifting uneasily near the fence. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring, but he didn't back away. He was alert, focused, as if he recognized whoever was out there. Isolde's hand hovered over her radio. Call for backup or confront them. A gust of wind kicked up the snow, obscuring her vision for a split second. When it settled, the figure was gone. Her stomach twisted. She threw open the door, stepping onto the porch, her boots crunching against the icy ground. The cold hit her like a slap, but she ignored it, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fence. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of pine trees swaying in the wind. But someone had been there. She turned back to Zephyr, who was still staring at the same spot, his body tense. Slowly, she approached him, running a calming hand along his neck. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, but his heartbeat was fast. "What do you know, little guy?" she murmured. Zephyr exhaled, shifting closer to her, his side pressing against her leg. Isolde pulled her radio from her belt and clicked the button. "Leaf, are you still at the station?" His voice crackled back almost instantly. "Yeah, just finishing up some paperwork." "What's up?" "I need you outside. Now." A pause. Then, "On my way." A minute later, Leaf stepped onto the porch, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "What's going on?" She gestured toward the tree line. There was someone out there. Watching. Leaf's expression darkened instantly. He scanned the area, his trained eyes sharp. "You sure?" "I know what I saw." He exhaled through his nose, then pulled a flashlight from his belt and started walking toward the fence. Isolde followed, her pulse quickening. They reached the spot where she had seen the figure, and sure enough, footprints. Fresh. Leading into the woods. Leaf crouched down, running a gloved hand over the tracks. Whoever it was, They weren't just passing through. They stood here for a while. He looked up at her. They were watching you. A chill ran down her spine. She turned back to Zephyr. The foal was still near the fence, ears perked, eyes locked onto the woods. He knew something, and whoever had been watching them knew him. Leaf stood, dusting the snow off his gloves. We need to figure out who that guy in the hospital is. If he was trying to save this foal, he might know who's behind all of this. Isolde nodded, already pulling out her phone. I'll check in with the hospital. Maybe he's awake. As she dialed the number, she glanced back at the woods one last time. The footprints disappeared into the darkness. And for the first time since this began, she felt it deep in her gut. Whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Isolde paced outside the hospital room, her fists clenched inside the pockets of her coat. The sterile air and the cold glow of fluorescent lights made her feel uneasy, but nothing unsettled her more than the uncertainty. The man was awake. After hours of unconsciousness, he had finally come to, and now she had a chance to get some answers. The doctor had been clear. Don't push him too hard. The extreme cold and exhaustion had taken a serious toll on his body, and any stress could worsen his condition. But Isolde couldn't just wait. Someone out there had been watching, and she needed to know why. She took a steadying breath and pushed the door open. The man was sitting up in bed, his skin still pale, but his dark brown eyes were open and alert. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. You found Zephyr. His voice was hoarse, weak, but there was something heavier beneath it. Isolde nodded. He led me to you. A shadow crossed the man's face. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling a long, exhausted sigh. I tried to save them. His voice broke, and when he opened his eyes again, they were filled with something raw. Pain. But I was too late. A cold wave of dread washed over Isolde. Who are they? The man hesitated, as if fighting an internal battle. Then, finally, he spoke two words that made her blood run cold. The government. Isolde's breath felt heavy in her chest as Calder's words sank in. The government was behind it. The thought sent a chill through her, colder than the Montana winter outside. She had expected poachers, illegal traders, maybe land developers. But this? A deliberate, organized effort to erase an entire herd? She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. Why? She demanded. Why would they do this? Calder's face was pale, his exhaustion visible in the way his shoulders slumped against the hospital bed. Because they needed the land, he murmured. Wild horses complicate development. They're protected, which means environmental regulations slow things down. Too much paperwork, too many restrictions. His jaw tightened. So they made the problem disappear. His eyes flicked toward the door, voice dropping lower. I was part of it at first. I didn't know what they were really doing until it was too late. A sick feeling settled in Isolde's stomach. This wasn't just corruption, it was something deeper. Systematic. Hidden. Dangerous. Zephyr, she whispered. If they wanted the herd gone, why leave him? Calder swallowed hard. I couldn't let them take him, he admitted. His mother, she was the lead mare. The strongest. They took her first. He let out a shaky breath. I tried to get there in time. I tried to stop it. But all I could do was save him. His eyes met hers. And now that he's alive, they'll come looking. A sharp knock on the door made both of them jump. Isolde's pulse spiked as a nurse peeked inside, her smile polite but unreadable. Miss Whitaker, she said, there's someone here to see you. Isolde's gut twisted. Something about this felt wrong. Slowly she stood, exchanging a glance with Calder before stepping out into the hallway. Leaf was waiting for her just outside the room, his arms crossed. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, the silver catching the fluorescent light. "Ranger Whitaker," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "We need to talk." Isolde's breath came slow and measured, but inside, her mind was racing. She glanced past them, toward the doors leading outside, where Zephyr was waiting. She had uncovered something bigger than she had ever imagined. And now, standing face to face with the people who wanted it buried, she knew one thing for certain: this was far from over.